All right, check, testing. Hopefully, I could be heard. This is your brother Wujao. I am live, should be live. And if anybody is actually tuned in right now and you're in the chat, first of all, peace to you, greetings, and let me know if I could be heard. Make sure my audio and everything is checking out all right. All right, I want to make this a short or a concise video as I can because I want to offer people a um, a little clarification on the COVID-19 testing. So I don't want to make this video too long where it's beyond digestible, being able to be digested and people skip over. They see how long the video is. So I want to make this as short as I can without missing over anything, any information in terms of clarification. All right, so I'm just going to kind of dive in. I normally would wait for people to kind of tune in who may have been notified that I'm live because this is an unplanned live session. All right, so so again, I appreciate anybody tuned in with me live. I can see the chat, so I'll be monitoring the chat, and maybe once I'm finished sharing some information, then I'll pay attention to the chat. So if you have any comments or something you want to share with me or a question, then if I have the answer, I'll do my best to answer it, or I may be able to point you in the right direction. Okay, so I want to dive straight in to this. And if you don't mind, please share this video around so that people that you feel may benefit from this conversation, they could benefit from it, or, they may have some insight. All right, so I appreciate that if you do that. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in. So the topic question is, let me get my cursor over here. All right, so the topic question is, well, first of all, SARS-CoV-2 is the formal name of the virus itself. COVID-19 is the name of the disease that the virus causes. All right, so pretty much people are straight on those two different terminologies, but quite often those two will be used synonymously. All right, so I don't want to get into a semantic division or any confusion. So I will be speaking about the COVID-19 or the um, COVID-19 testing, as people have been calling it, but I will make a distinction when necessary. All right. So what I want to talk about are the tests that we have been seeing. Some of you may have taken a test already, or seen it being discussed and talked about in the media or social media. Okay, so the question is, what will such a test tell us? What do these tests tell us? How, what's the benefit of these tests? All right, because there are a lot of people who are against being tested. They're encouraging people not to be tested, and then on the other side, people are getting tested and encouraging people to be tested. So, what are the facts about it, if any, and what do these tests inform us of? All right, so I'm just going to dive right in. All right, so first off, there are two types of tests related to the coronavirus. All right, SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. All right, there are two tests. And so we have to be very clear on the difference, and we have to make a distinction in speaking about it. All right. So on the left-hand side here, you see a viral test. So there's a viral test um, for COVID-19. And I'm sorry, I want to make sure I can see the chat as I'm speaking here. All right. So there's a viral test. And then the other type is being called the antibody test. So those are the two terms that you may hear floating around: viral test and antibody test. The viral test on the left is also called a PCR test, RT-PCR to be specific. And the PCR stands for uh, a polymerase chain reaction test. All right. And then it's also called a nasopharyngeal swab. Okay, so if you hear that term, they're talking about the viral test. You may also hear oral pharyngeal swabbing. Okay, and what those two things are, it's not really the name of the test per se, it's the manner in which the sample is collected. Okay, so now the viral test involves um, the healthcare taker or professional getting a sample from you, and they do it in your pharyngeal area, which is the back of your throat and upper throat in the back of your nose behind your nasal passage. That's where our pharyngeal area is. And so to get a good sample in that area, they go through the nose. And so this is why it's called nasopharyngeal. So they have to swab that area. Or, and now more recently, they are also doing optionally oral. They're getting to the pharyngeal area orally, back towards your tonsils or what have you. And so they're getting a sample that way. All right. So that is the viral test. Now, the antibody test on the right is done by a blood draw. Okay. So either they will prick your finger or they may draw blood from your vein or arm. All right. So that's the two distinguishable ways in which those two tests are carried out. All right. But we have to make a distinction about them because they inform us of two different things and they're done for, two different reasons. And it's very important. All right. So now back here on the left, what the viral test does is it looks for the actual RNA of the virus. All right, that's what that test is involved. It's looking for the RNA of the virus. So the sample that's taken from you is then examined, and the virus itself is being searched. The RNA of the virus, very specific RNA of the virus, is being looked for. On the right hand side, for the antibody test, where they draw your blood, when they look at your blood, they're looking for specific antibodies that's produced by you, by us, by our immune system. Okay. Specifically, our adaptive immune system. Okay. And so when a pathogen invades our body, our immune system mounts a defense against that invading pathogen. And part of that defense is our adaptive immune system. What it does, it produces antibodies, which are, without getting too sciencey or detailed, they're like um, they're like markers where if you're familiar with a military or even video games or whatever, what have you, um, they will mark a territory to be bombed, and so the antibodies will mark these pathogens to be destroyed by other white blood cells or immune cells, particularly phagocytes. So they mark it for, or they target it for destruction, basically. All right. Um, or they can neutralize the harmful effects of a pathogen. All right. So that's what the antibody test is looking for. It's looking for those antibodies. Now, um, the antibody test is also has been called an exposure test because it lets the test will inform you whether or not you've ever been exposed to a particular pathogen. In this case, it would be SARS-CoV-2. All right. So that's why you see exposure test. All right. So hopefully everyone will be clear on that. And that's very important to understand these distinctions because it's beneficial. Each test has its benefits and its pros and cons. All right. So we're going to get into that very quick. So now I'm going to just deal with the left hand side, which is the viral test. Okay. And so we're dealing with the PCR or viral test. Okay. Now, if you get tested and you get a PCR test performed on you, obviously you will come back with a positive result or a negative result. Those are the two options, and possibly inconclusive. But for the most part, we're dealing with positive and negative results. So what do they mean? All right. Now, if you get tested or a person gets tested and it comes back positive for the PCR test, it means that the RNA of the virus is present. Okay. There is presence of the RNA and of the virus. That means the virus is present. And being that it's present, it means that you're currently infected. That means you have an active infection. Okay. So you're actively infected. If it's negative, if the test comes back negative, then it means that you have no current infection because the RNA was not detected. All right. So I'm just giving the basics right now because there are, like I said, there's some pros and cons that I'm going to talk about shortly. All right. So that's the PCR, positive and negative, what that specifically means. Okay. If you get a positive result or a negative result. Now, moving over to the antibody test and what does a positive and negative result of it mean? Okay. If you take the antibody test and you get a positive result from it, it means that the antibodies were present. That means that they found or the antibodies exist in your blood. And what is that? What that means is that you were previously exposed to the pathogen. In this case, it'd be SARS-CoV-2, because our bodies would not produce these antibodies otherwise. All right. Also, what this means is that you possibly could have protective immunity from SARS-CoV-2 for any future infections. Okay. And I stress possible protective immunity. And that if that's the case, that protective immunity is likely going to be temporary. It's not going to be forever. You're not going to be immune for the rest of your life. All right. That's what the evidence and studies are showing. It's not permanent protective immunity. Should you have that protective immunity. Okay. So again, if you take an antibody test and it comes back positive, it means that antibodies are present. It means that you were previously exposed to the virus, and it means that you possibly have protective immunity. Now, if you take an antibody test and it comes back negative, it's the flip side of that. So it means that antibodies were not detected, and you possibly were not exposed um, to the virus, and highly likely you are not going to have any protective immunity. All right. So hopefully that's crystal clear. Now, those are the basics of these two tests and the difference. Okay. So again, there are two different types of tests, the viral test and the antibody test. And the viral test or the PCR test, positive and negative, what those generally mean, and the antibody test, positive and negative, and what it generally means. So now I'm going to go back to the PCR test because I want to talk about something that we hear in on social media and in the news as well, media, and that is false positives or false negatives when it comes to these tests. False positives and false negatives. Now, so the question is, how is that possible to get a false negative or a false positive? All right. So before I go into that, I want to walk through two scenarios. All right, we're going to walk through two scenarios of a person getting tested. But before I do that, I want to say that in order to determine a false positive or false negative, there has to be a subsequent test done or a re-examination of a sample. All right, specifically. So a sample has to either be re-examined or a new sample has to be taken from a person and tested, or that person getting tested again. Okay. So either they can take the same sample and re-examine it, or they can get a brand new sample from somebody and examine it and come back with a different result. All right. So this is how false positives and false negatives are determined. You can never take a single test or examine a single instance of a sample and know if it's false positive or false negative. Either way, you can't do that. All right. It's the same common sense as you will never know if a measurement of something is incorrect unless you go back and measure it a second or more times. Okay, you have to have two or more measurements to know if the first one is incorrect. All right, so this should be pretty much basic logic and common sense with that. All right, so now let's walk through some scenarios, because as I said, there are pros and cons with these tests. And I want to say, I should have said this first. Neither one of these tests are 100% perfect. Okay. Neither one of these tests are 100%. If anybody tells you that, they're lying. And matter of fact, I shouldn't even say that, because no one claims that. If you look at the literature about these tests, if you look on the different institutions and health websites and things, they will tell you that up front, that these tests are not 100%. And the the reason why is is very basic reasons why they're not 100%. And I'm going to kind of add that into the conversation as I walk through these scenarios. Okay, so here is scenario one. And mind you, I spoke about this a couple of days ago on Facebook. So um, a lot of what I have here is based on that conversation, but this will work for me for right now. Um, and hopefully you all can see this. So here's scenario one. So we have a person who shows noticeable symptoms. Okay, so hopefully y'all can see my cursor. So a person has shown noticeable symptoms, and you can look up what the symptoms are for COVID-19. Now, these symptoms of COVID-19, they definitely overlap the symptoms of other conditions, such as the flu, such as even allergies. Certain allergies, the symptoms from allergies will coincide with the same symptoms of COVID-19. So we have to be very mindful of symptoms and know that there is some overlapping for different things. All right. But in this scenario, we have a person that has some noticeable symptoms. Okay. So let's say they have a fever. They started, they went into a fever. They lost, maybe the taste. A couple of symptoms are fever, loss of taste and smell, fatigue, aching, different things like that. And so a person that has some noticeable symptoms, obviously during this pandemic, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, what's going on? Let me go get tested. Let me test to see if I've been infected. So they go get tested, and they get the PCR, or the nasopharyngeal swab, which is this test here. Make sure I spell it correctly. The nasopharyngeal swab, which looks for the RNA, as I said. And if it's present, that means there's an active infection. Okay, so this is the scenario. This person tested and they tested positive. Okay, and it means that they have an active infection. And again, the motivation for them getting tested in the first place was that some things were going wrong, and they had some noticeable symptoms. So what do they generally tell you? That person, they're going to tell them to quarantine for a minimum of 14 days. They're going to say, hey, self quarantine, a minimum of 14 days, and so on. So that's what's going to happen. Now, during those 14 days, based on how our immune system works, and this is something that we hope that happens, and the person doesn't have any comorbid conditions or pre-existing conditions that make them vulnerable and high risk, this person's symptoms will fade over time. Okay. Over those 14 days, their fever will break, and the symptoms will start to subside. They will diminish and they'll fade. All right. And that's a good thing. That's a good sign. That means that person's body has mounted defense and fighting off the infection, the virus. So always remember this: symptoms equals a fight. Symptoms equal a fight. It is an immune response to some form of danger or an enemy invading the body. All right. And so as the symptoms fade, that means that the immune system is doing its job. All right. So over those days, that's what's going to happen. That's what should happen. That's what we want to happen. Now, after the 14 days, that same person should go back and get tested again. The same type of test, nasopharyngeal. And again, let me spell it correctly. Nasopharyngeal test, the PCR test. So they get swabbed again. And again, it looks for the RNA of the virus, but this time it's not present. Therefore, there's no active infection, no more active infection. That means that their bodies did its job. All right. It fought off the virus, fought off the infection. All right. It got rid of the virus from the body. And that's a good thing. So that person tested positive at first. The virus ran the course, the immune system did its thing, and now the person gets tested 14 days later, and now they're testing negative. All right. So now, from there, it's not finished. Okay. That person should wait at least 28 days from the first positive test, which in this case will be an additional 2 weeks or 14 days. So 2 weeks later from this, the person should get tested a third time. Now, the third time, instead of getting a PCR test, they should get an antibody test again, which is the blood draw, or they'll prick your finger. All right. Because of what that test informs us of. If they get that third test as an antibody test and it comes back positive, then um, they're likely to have protective immunity. What that means is that their body produced antibodies, and the antibodies, there are enough antibodies in their system that it's going to provide a likely protective immunity. And again, I want to stress that protective immunity, even though they'll have it, it's not for life. You're not going to all of a sudden be super immune to SARS-CoV-2. And based on the science as of today, it is temporary. All right. But that is a very good thing. This scenario, as it's playing out, are all good signs. And that's what you want. Now, if they take that third test and it comes back negative, that means that their body may have done its job, but it didn't produce enough of the antibodies to be long lasting, or the antibodies depleted. Okay, because antibodies will deplete over time. All right, so the antibodies either depleted and they will have no protective immunity. Now, in that scenario, the person is just as vulnerable as they were from the get go. That means that they can get reinfected. All right. And studies and the science has shown so far to date that in such a case, if a person gets reinfected after going through some symptoms, they may be mild or what have you, and go through the course of this scenario, if they get reinfected, the symptoms the second time around are more severe. Okay, that's what the studies and science is showing as of today. Now, as they learn more, that may change, but that's where it's at right now. Okay, so that's scenario one. All right, so now let me go through to scenario two. So here's scenario two. Scenario two starts off with a person that has no symptoms. They don't have any symptoms. They're just minding their business. And again, let me make sure I spell this word correctly. Should have caught this before. So they're just minding their business. And so now what would motivate a person that had no symptoms or anything to go get tested? So it's a couple of reasons. One, they may be scheduled to visit their loved ones, elderly loved ones, their mother, parents, or grandparents, and they just want to be sure because they know the risk that's involved if should they be infected. Okay, so that could be a reason. Another reason is that your job, a person's job, to go back to work, they're saying, "Hey, go get tested," and so they may need to get tested to clear themselves to go back to work. Or somebody just may have felt that they've been around somebody that has tested positive, and they're not sure if they did anything to be exposed themselves. All right. So those are just a couple of reasons why someone with no symptoms would go get tested. All right. So this is the scenario: a person with no symptoms. All right. So they go get tested. They get the swab done. And again, it looks for the RNA of the virus and it's present. That means that there's an active infection. The person has been infected. If that's the case, then that person at the time of the test is usually referred to as asymptomatic. Why? Because they don't express any symptoms. All right, so they refer to as asymptomatic. In such a case, that person is also told to self quarantine. Why? Because even though you don't show any symptoms, you can transmit the virus to other people. So they're going to tell you to self quarantine for the same amount of time, the 14 days. All right. Now, obviously, during those 14 days, there are no symptoms to fade. So there will be no fading of any symptoms because they never had any symptoms in the first place. Okay. Now, I don't have it on the screen here, but let's just say no symptoms at the time of the test. But let's say while they're in quarantine during those 14 days, they start showing symptoms. So let's just say symptoms start to show. Now that person is relabeled a pre-symptomatic person because at the time of the test they show no symptoms, but then eventually they did. Okay, so let me just get the terminology over here consistent for a second. Because again, like I said, I want this video to be helpful to people. So this is be a pre-symptomatic situation. Okay, so that person would be pre-symptomatic at the time of the test, no symptoms, um, and they would be potentially asymptomatic. But then, hey, while they're in quarantine, they start to show some symptoms. So that would be a pre-symptomatic person at that time. And again, same thing. They can transmit the virus. So regardless, they're gonna go through their quarantine. Their immune system is gonna kick in and do its thing. That's what we hope, and that's what people should hope for. And how your immune system does its thing will be based on how optimal or how optimized your immune system is, and that the level of optimization of your immune system will depend on a lot of factors. And one of the main factors is obviously your health, your lifestyle. You're not going to flick a switch and all of a sudden get your immune system in tip top optimal shape overnight. You know, it's basically how you live your lifestyle in terms of your health up to that point. All right. You can't wait to the last minute to all of a sudden, you know, try to go out in the bush and pick all these herbs and eat all of a sudden become a vegan, a vegetarian, and these things like that. All right. So I want to make sure I'm gonna revisit that topic as well. But at that point though, when your immune system kicks in and puts up that fight, it's going to depend on the status of the immune system. But anyway, we're told to quarantine 14 days. Um, during that time. And let me tell you why the 14 days. 14 days is the mean because based on the science, there's an incubation period and then there is a battle. There's a period of the battle where your immune system is fighting off the infection itself. And so that added together the incubation period where the virus um, enters your body and starts to proliferate and start to invade cells and duplicate, replicate, and all the other kind of stuff. That's the incubation period before it starts to noticeably destroy cells. And then the destruction of the cells, the immune system kicks in, and all that good stuff. All of that added together is roughly 14 days. And it's a give or take type of situation. So don't hold 14 days to any fire. All right. Um, so now, after the 14 days, hopefully, even if they were pre-symptomatic or some symptoms show, hopefully it faded. And if they're asymptomatic throughout the whole course, then they will be truly asymptomatic, no symptoms. But still, that person should go and get tested again, just like the other scenario. They should get tested again, second time. And so let's say they do. They get tested. It looks for the RNA of the virus. None are present. That's a great thing. That's very good. No infection. That's what it means. No current infection, no active infection. So, likewise, that person should then go and get a third test. And that third test, again, should be the antibody test. And if it's positive, the same explanation, it means that antibodies are present. That means the immune system did its thing, and they likely have a temporary protective immunity. If the antibodies are negative or they don't show up, um, it could be that the antibodies that were there to fight off the infection are no longer um, in a quantity where the test could pick it up and it depleted over time, which is what happens. You know, there's cases where that happens, and therefore you won't have any protective immunity. All right. So hopefully everybody understands those two scenarios. Now I'm going to use these two scenarios to give the pros and cons of all of this. Like what else could these things mean? And this is something everybody got to consider. So I'm gonna revisit the disclaimer or the point is that neither one of these tests, the PCR or the antibody test, is 100% accurate out of all the tests. You're not going to get that. If you believe that, you're in la la land and you're delusional. Okay, nobody makes that claim, so don't have that expectation. These tests are beneficial because they inform us of important things that will help us make informed decisions. Okay, but at the same time, it's not 100%. Okay, so we got to take the best that we utilize the best that we can. Okay, so now let's take the same scenario too. Okay, so we have a person who has no symptoms at all. And the only reason why they're getting tested is because, like I said, they may be visiting one of their grandparents or their job required them to do it or whatever the case is. And it comes back positive. Now, because it comes back positive and they don't have any symptoms, they're still told to quarantine. So they quarantine and then they get a second test. It comes back negative. Now, at that point, that type of person, you're really not sure if that first test may have been a false positive. And see, so here's where a false positive can come into play. All right. One of the ways that a false positive can come into play because you show no symptoms and then your second test show no infection, then that first test may be a false positive, may have been a false positive. So that person getting the third test, if the antibody test does come back positive, which means the antibodies are present, then it was not a false positive. That means that you truly were infected and then your body fought it off, but you never showed any symptoms though. And then you now you have the immunity or the antibodies for some protective immunity. Okay. So that would rule out the false positive. Now, what would keep the false positive alive is if your antibody test came back negative. So if you had an active infection or a positive test first, a negative test for your second one, PCR one, and then your antibody test also came back negative after, which would be 28 days again total, then you're still in the ballpark of that first test could possibly have been a false positive. All right. And so that would be your situation in that situation. And there's really nothing else that you can gain from that data on your test. All right. So that's not what we want, but that's the cards that person would be dealt. All right. So and that's a con. That's not a pro. You don't want to be in that situation like, man, was the first test really positive? Did I really test positive? So you're still gonna have a question mark. And that is the downside of these tests, especially for asymptomatic people. Okay. So now I'm gonna go back to scenario two. Excuse me, scenario one. Now, a person that does have symptoms, they don't have that same situation because they did show symptoms. So their con would play out a little differently. So if a person has noticeable symptoms, they tested positive the first time, they tested negative the second time. Now, what leans more towards ruling out a false positive in this situation is because the person has symptoms. Okay. But it doesn't rule out that those symptoms could very well have been the influenza flu or what have you. So in that case, if that whole scenario played out and this a person who shows symptoms um play out all the way, then that person could get an influenza test. And by the way, now the CDC has put together, I'm not sure if the CDC itself, but they have a test that exists that will test for influenza at the same time that it tests for SARS-CoV-2. Okay. And that's good news. So they'll test both at the same time. That way, it'll start ruling out these questionable false positives for people who go through the scenario as I was explaining it. Okay. So that's a good thing. All right. So hopefully that will be clear to everyone. The pros is that if you have some symptoms and you test positive, you better err on the side of caution and quarantine. You don't want to knowingly test positive and then transmit to somebody. Trust me on that. You don't want to be infected and then go around a loved one and infect them. And although you're healthy and you show no symptoms or some mild symptoms, but then if they get infected, they go through some severe tough times and even possibly could die. You do not want that um on your hands. Okay? So the self quarantine is paramount. Very important. All right? And we might not like it, but it's recommended, highly recommended. Now, so from here I want to just quickly jump to some extremes. All right, so let me switch my screen over. And what I want to show you all is some of the noise that's out there on the internet regarding this topic, what I'm talking about. Okay. Now, some of it, when I say noise, I don't want to be dismissive. There's some valid concerns. So I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing the valid concerns. All right. So there are some valid concerns, and that's why I'm going to discuss it real quick. So on my screen, hopefully you can see it, is a website. This is MSN, by the way. This is an article, and I'm not sure if you all can read it. Hopefully you can. Let me make sure. Let me see something here. Okay, well, hopefully you all can read it. If you can't, this is MSN, and you can see the headline. So you just do a search for this headline, and you should be able to pull it up. All right, so it says state lab finds 90 positive COVID-19 test results. State lab finds 90 positive COVID-19 test results were false. All right. So I'm gonna quickly read a bit of it. It says 90 people who received positive COVID-19 results did not have the virus, according to the State Department of Public Health. The department said the state public health laboratory uncovered a flaw in one of the testing systems it uses to test for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and 90 of 144 people tested between June 15th and July 17th received a false positive COVID test report. Many are many are nursing home residents. State officials said the flaw has been reported to the manufacturer, and the Federal Food and Drug Administration and DPH has taken immediate steps to make sure the patients are notified. According to the State Department of Health, the errant testing results were from a widely used laboratory testing platform that the state laboratory started using on June 15th. In a quote, it says, "We have notified the healthcare facilities for everyone who received a false positive test result from our state laboratory." Acting Commissioner Deidre Gifford said in a statement, quote again, "Accurate and timely testing for the novel coronavirus is one of the pillars supporting effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic." She said adjustments have already been made to ensure the accuracy of future test results from this platform. All right. It goes on to say that they said all positive tests results will be further analyzed by multiple laboratory scientists and, if indicated, retested using another method. All right. So that should be interpreted as good news. That is good science. Why is that good science? Is because the laboratory itself uncovered a flaw in its testing system. It's unfortunate that 90 people received a flawed or a false positive result, but they corrected the error and notified those people, those 90 people. All right. So this should be looked at as science at work. This is how science works. Okay, especially laboratories. If you know anybody that's a laboratory technician, especially in the medical field or any field, they work in a laboratory or a factory, you'll know that factories and laboratories, they always go through um, self-testing, self-diagnostics and things like that to assure that the machines are working correctly, that the outcomes are what they're supposed to be, and so on and so forth. So these laboratories um, and factories that make different things, they're going to discover their own flaws or their own problems within the labs and factories. And so this is a case um, that happened. All right. So this should be seen as this is what we should want from laboratories. All right. Because mistakes can happen, and they do happen. And it did happen in this case. All right. But so this brings about a valid concern. Now, what I meant by noise though is that people will read this and look at this and use this to say all of the numbers are fake. All of the numbers are flawed. All the numbers we get in the media, they're trying to instill fear. They go to conspiracy route. See, it's a conspiracy. The government is trying to scare us and take away our liberties and put microchips in us. Then you get all of these different wild conspiracy theories and people parroting those types of things. So that's what I mean by noise. So there is a valid concern because we want accuracy. And it's a good thing that this laboratory uncovered, discovered, whatever, a flaw, and they corrected it. That is what we want. That is how they are supposed to do. Okay. So let's move from there. And let's go to this article. This is a recent article 2 days ago. This is from MSN website as well. Okay. And if you can't read it, search this headline right here. It says concerns arise as some receive positive COVID-19 results but never got tested. Now, this headline should blow your mind. You're like, wait a minute. Okay. Pump the brakes. There's a very valid concern with this one. You're like, wait a minute. So you mean to tell me that people are getting positive results, but they were never tested? Now, the first thought, though, or the extreme thought, is that people are chilling in their house, minding their business, never signed up for a test, never booked an appointment for a test, never even thought about getting a test, never did anything to indicate that they are trying to be tested, get tested, or what have you. And then all of a sudden, they're coming up positive, COVID-19 positive. Okay. That's the extreme mentality when people read this. But let me tell you, that is far from the case. But on social media, you got people who are running with that mentality. And that's what I mean by noise. All right. So we have to kill that noise. So what happened here? All right, because this is a big concern. This is a big concern, and this is a big mistake. This is something that we definitely need to pay attention to, and make sure that this is corrected, and don't never happens. Okay, within reason. I mean, people make mistakes, but this is a big concern. So anyway, so what happened here? So let's read it. This is Sarasota, Florida. Probably butchered that name. Sarasota, Florida. It says coronavirus continues to spread quickly across the state. Plus, now on the Sun Coast, although testing has been made more available, many say there are problems in really getting a handle on how much the virus is in our community. And going down, it says it has nothing to do with being able to get tested, but instead the results. The quickest turnaround is about 48 hours, and the majority of the time, it can take about a week of finding out if you're infected or not. However, the most recent issue is getting back results that aren't even yours. And this is key. Results that aren't even yours. And I want y'all to pay attention to that. So here's a quote. I got a call. This is a person who this happened to. She says, I got a call asking for me, and they told me that I had tested positive. I was like, positive for what? Then the lady said, for COVID. And I said, that's impossible. I never got tested, ma'am. And this is from Mindy Clark, obviously a person who this happened to. Now, Clark, which is a person, Clark had gone to the drive-through testing site. This is key now. I want y'all to understand this. This is a person who went through the drive-through testing site at Manatee Rural Health, but before she was able to get swabbed, she left the line because she realized it was for people with symptoms only. Okay, it was for people with symptoms only. So she left the line. But she was there. And here's the point, even before I read any more. This Mindy Clark, this person, Mindy Clark, she was at a testing site. She had to have submitted her information. How else would she have gotten a call? Okay. She had to submit her information, but before actually being tested or a sample being taken from her, she left. And that's important. I want to make sure that everybody understands that. So let's keep on going. She goes on to say, I told them they needed to take this off my record. And they said I had to prove it to them that I wasn't positive, Clark continued. And then so she tested negative just 2 days later and also tested negative for the antibodies. Plus, according to many of our viewers, this hasn't only happened to her. And it says Clark said if she and many others have been incorrectly identified as positive in the state system so easily, how accurate are the numbers that are released daily? Okay, so here's the important takeaway from this. This is how you kill the extreme mentality and that noise that people are using this. Now, this is a problem. So I don't want to sound like I'm downplaying this error because this is what we don't want and we don't need. All right. So I want everybody to be clear on that. But what the quack followers and conspiracy parrots are doing, they're taking this and they're going extreme. So what what happened here? Now, let me give you an example that I'm familiar with, that I am personally familiar with. I know a person that this has happened to here in Georgia. All right, I was in a call and I had an opportunity to hear her story and to speak, and the same thing happened. What it is, it's not that that person had a false positive because even this person, Mindy Clark, she had no sample taken from her. So if you never give a sample, you can never get a result back. So what really happened was it's a clerical error on the part of the healthcare workers or at the testing site. What happens is you book your appointment and then they tell you to come through the drive-through. They give you the time and the day, and then you go through the drive-through and there's other people in line, obviously, before, in front of you, maybe behind you or after you or whatever the case is. And this person found out that, wait a minute, this is only for people who show symptoms. So that don't include me. I don't have any symptoms. So let me exit out of this line. But yet she gave her information. And so the big huge error is that somebody tested positive. And so somebody's sample got assigned the name and information for Mindy Clark. That is where the error is. So somebody out there tested positive, but they identified or assigned it to the wrong person. Now, if Mindy Clark never showed up at a testing site, never gave her information, never booked an appointment to be tested, whatever the case is, how in the world could Mindy Clark ever get any result or whatever the case is? They're not just going into the phone book and the yellow pages, just picking people's names by random. No, these are um, serious clerical errors that should not happen and that should raise concern. So I'm familiar with a person here in Georgia. This exact same thing happened to. Her name is Brenda, by the way. And the same thing happened. She booked an appointment. She had the date and the time, and she went there. She was ahead. She got there early, and she was waiting in line because there was a line of cars in front of her, and they tell you not to get out your car and all that good stuff. So they waiting in line, one car after the other. And she said that it takes about 10 to 15 minutes per person. So every car in front of her is about 10 to 15 minutes of a wait. And so she was there, but her appointment time conflicted with something else she had to do. So at the last minute, she had to leave. So she got out of the line and left. She was never tested. And the same thing happened to her. She was contacted and she was told that she tested positive. And but she told them what happened, that she left. She never got tested in the whole nine. And long story short, the testing facility or place, they tracked it down and they found out that yes, there was an error, a huge error, and they formally apologized and they gave her um that all that stuff in writing to make sure that she's straight and all that other stuff. But they had to track it down. Now with that site, when they tracked it down, the false assignment of a positive test, now they're in a bind too, because now they have to find out who the positive test really was for. So they had to contact a couple of more people that tested that same day in that same window of time. So that was a big blunder. And so again, I don't want to be confused. This is a problem. This is a problem that we don't need and we don't want. But the quack followers and the conspiracy theorists, they're mischaracterizing the problem. They're taking a real problem, but they're running with it. And they're feeding into, oh, it's all a hoax, all the numbers are fake, they're skewing the numbers, it's not as bad, really is no such thing as a virus, the coronavirus is created in a laboratory, all these different things. This kind of stuff fuels it. And so all I'm doing is separating that silly noise from the real problem. So again, this is a problem. All right. And so when I spoke to the Brenda, when I had opportunity to ask her a couple of questions, she let me know, and that was a big problem. But luckily, she they tracked it down, and it was an error, and that's a huge error. But now here's the thing: those errors they can happen, and it obviously did happen, and especially if there's a large testing facility and you have all of these cars pulling up, like that you see on the news, where you have these large testing facilities and these tents, and people drive up and everything. Remember, they're taking a sample, they're putting it in a tube, they're sealing the bags up and stuff like that. And between taking the sample and holding the bag and putting it in the bag, there could possibly be mix-ups, and that's what likely happened, if it should happen. We don't want it. We don't like it. We don't need it, but it happens. So we got to be diligent and be mindful of that. All right. So that's pretty much it. All right. Again, I don't want to make this video too long. I just wanted to address those few things. Hopefully, me going over this um, will help somebody out. Maybe they were wondering what's up and everything like that. Um, be diligent, research, but do your best not to fall for the extremism that's out there. It's a lot of it. It's a lot of noise out there. All right. Think logically, you know, and all that good stuff. But anyway, so how long have I been on here? This is not telling me. It looks like, oh, I'm just at an hour. This is a good time to stop. I'm gonna quickly go over the comments if anybody had any comments. So again, listen, I appreciate anybody who's tuned in. Um, this is a totally unannounced thing, but I want to have it on my YouTube site because I feel that it may benefit a couple of people. I've had this talk on Facebook and so on, and some people still didn't quite get it. And I get, you trying to type on the comments, it's hard to really explain things. All right. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or what have you, please answer it now. I want to get those out the way if I can. But peace to everybody. Appreciate everybody tuned in. I see we have Harry Morgan, Yahuru Drums, Hotep, peace. Zane, Jay Carter, Tamika, Amber, Unbiased Sports, June Money, Master Khalik, Atif Baka, or Atef Baka. That's pretty much it. All right, so let me just see any questions. Okay, it says June Money said they need to lessen the time for results. Yes, definitely, they really do. But listen, a lot of people are being tested. A lot of people are being tested. As a matter of fact, like I said, my sister is a healthcare worker, and her and her colleagues, I talk to them and so on, and they're bombarded with testing, and really, it's not the testing sites. Okay, let me make that a bit clear. It's not really the testing sites; it's the labs. The labs are being inundated with tests, and it takes time to run these tests. Okay, some stuff is machine and automated, but I mean they still have to do these things. So they're getting overloaded with tests, and so it's taking 6 to 10 days to get a test result back. Now me, I want my test result right then and there. Like, if you're gonna prick my finger, I want to know what's going on right there while I'm standing there, you know, and everything. That's what we would love to have. But those point of contact, they call them point of contact results, those fast results you get in 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, those are for the extreme cases. Those are for people who are very ill or being hospitalized and stuff like that. Okay, so just to put that out there, they do have them, and so but it's it's a different way that they do that, and so they're prioritizing that to healthcare facilities, hospitals and things like that. Let's see. So Zane says they're doing it all unbiased. I invited a good brother to listen in. Hopefully he had the time. Okay. Zane, clerical error can happen. It could be an honest mistake. Yeah. Hey, they can happen. Listen, let me ask y'all real quick, and I know there's a delay. Have y'all ever heard? Now, I'm sure you may not know somebody, but have you ever heard of even women who give birth to a child and their child is mistakenly um, labeled as somebody else's child? Have y'all ever heard? Are we? Do we have cases like that? Now they're rare, hopefully, but um, mistakes have happened. Mistakes have happened. You know, misidentification for paperwork. It happens. It happens. We don't want it to happen, man, and we don't need it to happen. It's unfortunate, but it does. All right. So, anything else? Um, okay, Tef, he says it's not silly when you have proof to back up what you say. Yeah. Atef, anybody that has evidence to support what they're claiming, then that's good. That's great. So, unless you have something specific you want to bring up, I don't really know what you're talking about, but just in general principle, that's all that matters is the evidence. Because a lot of people could say anything. I could tell you anything, you know, but what evidence do you have to support your claim? That's the important part. All right. So, if you're still there and you're listening, if you have something specific that you're talking about, then go ahead and type that in. But if you're addressing me saying silly noise and claims, I'm talking about that. I can be very specific. So let me be very specific. It is outright silly and insane and stupid and retarded for people to think that a virus does not exist, that viruses don't exist, period, let alone forget, this particular virus. There are people out there that think that there's no such thing as viruses. Then there are people out there that think that the SARS-CoV-2 virus that we're dealing with right now is all a hoax. That is insane and silly. All right. That's what I'm saying. Now, if they say it's all a hoax and it doesn't exist, then the onus or the burden of proof is on them to show, okay, these people are being infected with something and showing symptoms of something, and it's a cascade of events taking place in their bodies, outwardly expressing as symptoms and potentially dying. What is your explanation of that? If there's no such thing as the virus that infected them to cause that cascade of events in the first place. All right. So that's what I'm talking about. This extremism that people are doing and going with and dealing with. All right. So that's what I'm referring to. If people have evidence, then they should present the evidence. And remember, demonstration of evidence always beats conversation. Because like anybody could talk. I'm up here talking. Anybody could talk. Anybody could type something. Okay. So, we want the evidence. Science is the domain of evidence. Logic is a domain of mathematics. Okay. And those two work together. And so we're dealing with a lot of numbers. We're dealing with a lot of metrics, a lot of digits, a lot of data coming from all kinds of places, different states that do things different in different ways. They have to be collected and cataloged and everything. So we're bound to see mistakes. There are margins of error. Anybody that think that these numbers that we're dealing with nationwide are supposed to be 100% accurate, you are delusional. Okay. It will be a serious problem to have that mentality that all these numbers are supposed to be 100% dead on. There is a margin of error. They tell you it's a margin of error. And so the benefit of these numbers is to inform us by looking at the trends and the patterns. When they talk about curves, lowering the curve, how the curve is a steep increase, the rate of increase, the mortality rate, the positivity rate, the rate of spread, all these rates, that's what we need and look at. But the accuracy of the numbers, if there's 100 positive tests and there's a margin of error, and let's say 10 of those are questionable, we still have 90. So what does that tell us? That means that the virus is spreading. And if it spreads at a rate, okay, if there are 100 new cases today, and then there's 100 new cases tomorrow, then the rate didn't change. It went from 100 to 100, so the rate stayed the same. But if it goes 100 today, 100 tomorrow, and it jumps 1,000 the next day, and then 10,000 the day after that, even if the numbers there's a margin of error, what we know is that the rate is increased. That means the virus is spreading like wildfire. Okay, somebody is not doing something that they're supposed to do. People are out spreading the virus, transmitting it to other people. Okay, or something's going on. That's what matters. All right, so we got to keep that in mind. All right, so I don't think there's any more questions, and like I said, I don't want to keep this video too long. So again, I appreciate anybody tuned in, and hopefully people can have some takeaways with what I shared. And if you have any questions, obviously leave a comment under the video, and I'll see it and respond to it. Um, you know, and I'll leave it at that. So I really appreciate it, and thanks for you all to tune in. So I'm gonna say peace.